Hello and welcome to Talkernate History, the podcast where we,
Matt
and Max, talk about works of alternate history scenarios, and history in general. This episode, we're going to return to an editor that we have a great deal of love for, and that man is Peter Tsouras.
The best.
The best. It's been so long since we've done one of these Peter Tsouras short story compilations.
I know, which is crazy because it seemed like we've covered a lot of them, but we've got another one here today, and there's actually two other ones out there as well still.
There's Dixie Victorious.
Yes, and Over the Top, which is a World War I compilation.
It's got Sylvester Stallone, and he's... No.
That's
different Over the Top.
No, but today's returns to our one of our favorite topics, and that would be World War II, of course.
Yes, of course.
We're going to be talking about the Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's Alternate Scenarios, which is a compilation, 10-story compilation of stories involving, I would say it's really the Northwestern European campaign from D-Day through the Battle of the Bulge. They're not all focused just on the Bulge.
Some of them don't mention the Bulge at all.
Yes, in fact. Obviously, it's easier to lead off with that than, alternate scenarios of the Northwest European campaign, 1944 to 45. This is a really good compilation and has some really good stories. And we have, I think, some of the stories in here are some of the most realistic alternate history stories you will read, and some that are not.
The most imaginative short stories that you'll read in a Tsouras compilation.
Yes. So I'm excited to get into this. And we're actually recording it on June the 6th.
That's correct.
So there are some D-Day stories in here. So how fitting.
Yes. Very appropriate.
So let's get into this.
Okay.
And I don't think we have to lay out really the baseline much more than we already have. It's pretty much the same setup, 10 stories, fake footnotes, that the whole Tsouras deal.
There's actually 2 stories written by Tsouras in this one instead of the customary one that you usually get.
I think he gets up to 4 in the Over the Top.
No way!
It's 3 or 4, I think.
Huh. I'm looking forward to that. Oh boy.
I'll lend you my copy.
But it actually starts off with an introduction written by Peter Tsouras. And it's, it just basically explains what alternate history is and why it's important and whatnot. Though there's a very funny part. He throws some shade at the academic historians who don't like counterfactual history. He says something like, academic historians who never feel any passion at all as they disturb the dust of their books. It's like...
Which could be phrased as, hi, I'm Peter Tsouras, and here's my middle finger.
Screw you. Fantastic.
But he's making a good point, which is that some historians will say, we need to learn what actually happened and not talk about counterfactuals. But obviously, as the last 6 years of us doing this point out that there's a lot to be had in counterfactual. So I agree with him. Perhaps that's a strong wording, but I agree with him that there is value in the counterfactual.
No passion at all. But yeah, we got 10 stories, and the first one begins around D-Day.
Yeah.
Actually, before D-Day.
Yes. It's called Monty's D-Day, Con and Beyond. So it's by David Isby, who's he often contributes to these. He did the Japan Conquers India story, and he's done some other Tsouras stories. He's in several of these compilations. So this story is dry, I would say, in comparison to some of the other ones.
Yes. There's no fake footnotes, for God's sakes. Come on, man.
I think Isby is like an attorney or like an analyst in real life. So he writes very well, but I mean, these are very analytical. This is like it's interesting. So basically the premise of this story is that he's almost wargaming out how can the Allies achieve better results on D-Day? And he's particularly focusing on the British sector and focusing on how do the British take Caen on D-Day? And that was a goal for sure that the British had, was to take Caen and to push as far south as they could to create the biggest lodgment before German counterattacks come. And if you go back to our second episode, we talk about that Peter Tsouras story, the disaster at D-Day, and in that the British take Caen on the first day. And this is Isby going through and laying out how do the British get to that point. And he spends a lot of time talking about British strategy and whether or not a division was better because it had an organic armored regiment and stuff like that.
There's not a lot of talk of Americans at all in like the first 2/3 of this story.
I think maybe the American sector given the terrain that perhaps the goals were just different. But basically, he's not focusing on that. He's focusing on how do the British take Caen on D-Day. And really what he talks about is that very realistically breaking down how training went. And apparently there's areas of Dorset and other parts of England that have hedgerows that somewhat resemble Normandy. So he posits perhaps additional training there. And what the big thing they do is that they use Hobart's funnies, of course, our 79th Armored Division, yay.
Yes.
But also that they would, instead of landing the second wave or on the day of D-Day, they would be landing armored brigades, at least in this story, I think one from the 7th Armored Division, the famous Desert Rats Division, and then some other armored brigades so that these armored brigades could push forward as fast as they could. And this was also going to be aided by landing an additional airborne division, because at D-Day there was 3 airborne divisions that landed. 82nd and 101st American in the American sector, and then the British 6th Airborne, famous for Pegasus Bridge and the Merville Battery. But in this one, they land the British 1st Airborne Division as well. They basically strip some American units of bazookas and other equipment. And the 1st Airborne, that's the Red Devils, the division that fought at Arnhem. But here they land at, I think it's Carpiquet Airfield, which is outside of Caen. And basically what they do is this additional landing plus these armored brigades and some additional training and planning lead to Caen falling on D-Day.
And it doesn't really analyze the ramifications of that because there are no fake footnotes. So you don't get those cheeky, this book, The Fall of Berlin by the Allies. And,
exactly.
You don't get any of that
That's
fun
true.
stuff.
And basically, it's interesting. And this one really keeps its nose to the grindstone with the historical reality. He basically says, these are things I believe the British could change. Mm-hmm. I think they could have taken Caen. And by taking Caen, it allows for, first of all, the city doesn't get completely obliterated, because if you go to Caen today, which I have been, it's totally rebuilt. The whole city got leveled pretty much during the fighting outside the city, and that really held up the British. But in here, they have more space to work with. They have one less objective. And the point in real life was to draw as much of the armor, the panzer divisions, to the British side to let the Americans break out. And in this one, even more is drawn to the British sector because the British have taken Caen so early, and they defeated the 21st Panzer counterattacks. And so basically the Germans have to focus almost exclusively on the British armor-wise.
And Operation Cobra, that big breakout, ends up happening 10 days earlier. It happens on July 15th instead of 25th, right?
Yes, it does. And so the Allies break out. And basically the same failures that Monty had in the campaigns like Epsom and Totalize and all that happened in real life still happen here, because there's only so much that this training could accomplish, and that's his point.
He's constantly making digressions, saying, well, it's just not realistic that the bomber force would be accurate enough to make a difference in here. Mm-hmm. It's very measured.
It is measured, but it hints at, the wording hints at the Allies actually closed the Falais gap. Mm-hmm. But then it also, actually, let me look. I've got the book right in front of me. There may have been a footnote where it talks about something at Arnhem. There are a couple fake footnotes. I apologize.
What? No way.
Robert Urquhart, Caen and Arnhem. John Allen Fairley, Remember Caen and Arnhem, the story of 1st Airborne Reconnaissance Squadron. So I guess Arnhem happens as well. That's not so clear. And then David Iswitz, Panzermeier, his tactical successes and his execution for war crimes. That did not happen in real life.
Are there asterisks next to them?
Mm-hmm.
Oh,
Michael Whitman, okay. Michael Wittmann, Last Hero in a Losing Battle, the posthumous autobiography of Michael Wittmann.
Well, darn. I'll be darned.
But not as many as some of the other people. Tsouras is nothing but fake footnotes, and that's just
beautiful.
But, I guess the point is, and I've been talking a lot, and I want to fax it.
Ain't no problem with that.
But the point is this is very interesting, because he's taking this apart. This is how, if you want to write the most realistic alternate history, this is about it. Because I think it is realistic that the Allies could have taken Caen. And as it does, it speeds up the Normandy campaign, but not outrageously. It's not June 20th and they're breaking out. Right. But 10 days, that's very believable.
Mm-hmm. You said that you've been to Caen. Is that where Festiland is, or is that somewhere else?
It's kind of near there. It's kind of on the outskirts. It's like an amusement park. There's two. So when I went to Normandy, I didn't spend a whole lot of time in Caen itself, although I did have to take the train back to Paris from there. I did go to Pegasus Bridge, which is kind of north of it. And you realize how it's not that much difference in distance, at least from those bridges to the beach. But there's this thing called Festiland, which is this park kind of near Caen. And then there's near Sword Beach, there's a merry-go-round and kind of a little thing. And I don't know if it was connected to Festiland, but I was thinking is this the proper way to,
Battlefield preservation.
Yeah, exactly. Is this the way to do it?
Go to like Gettysburg and there's like a giant Ferris wheel there.
Yeah, exactly.
Like, what?
Like the next Disney World park is going to be built in Antietam. We're going to have like a ride where you go through and like a dark ride, but there's going to be Confederate soldiers. And it's like, what the?
There's corn everywhere. Oh, no.
Oh, yeah. No, your ride vehicle looks like a wagon, No, but and that it's something, I guess, while we're talking about the Normandy related ones, that the American beaches are less commercial than the British beaches. Because you go to Sword Beach, there's like houses right on the beach and people are out and about. It's not like a national park here where people who go there are like tourists. And as our guide pointed out when we were there, these are where these people live. People are sunbathing at Omaha Beach and you find that a little disturbing. You're like, why is that happening? And I even kind of pointed it out. And he's like, well, it's like, this is where they live. Maybe this is not the most appropriate thing, but this is their beach just as much as your beach in the United States is.
Yeah, I guess there's something to be said for that. Mm-hmm. Life has to go on at some point. You can't take this plot of land where all these people died and just leave it perfectly preserved forever. Exactly. Especially when it's this
that big,
beachfront property. Yeah, and it's huge.
Exactly. There is a golf course near Omaha Beach. It's called like the Omaha Beach Golf Course. And it's like, I guess is that for people who are like, I want to come in, go to the American Cemetery and go to the beach and all that. And then I was so tired that I felt like playing around a golf afterwards.
9 holes in real quick.
Yeah. But yeah, this is a good story. So it's interesting.
The next story is a Peter Tsouras classic.
By the Throat.
By the Throat. Decision at Falais.
Yeah. So this one posits, how do the Allies close the Falais gap, which was a huge, perhaps missed opportunity.
So a lot of people escaped from the Falais gap, but there was a pocket eventually.
And a lot were captured, or killed.
You've seen all those pictures of all the dead horses everywhere.
And that was a near-run thing. And the point of this is that the troops that escaped from Falais, perhaps if they leave their equipment, or at least the troops on which the German army is rebuilt that fights at the Bulge and later on at Arnhem into 45. And what this posits is that what happens is Operation Cobra happens. Patton breaks out at like Avranches and they punch through. They go into Brittany and Patton's swinging back out. So they've cleared out Brittany and parts of Normandy, yet the Germans kind of launch a counteroffensive to try and cut that off, and it fails in real life. Well, in this one, it posits that several panzer divisions somehow managed to get enough fuel that they join this attack. So this attack nearly cuts through the American lines, but doesn't.
Yeah, Sepp Dietrich is there.
He is.
Personally.
But what happens, because those panzer divisions move out of the line, it's just regular infantry divisions. So when these Canadians launch these attacks in front of Falais, they make better progress. They punch into Falais itself. Sepp Dietrich is actually wounded and captured. And then what happens is that there's better coordination between the Allies. So Patton's troops, it's actually the French 2nd Armored Division, links up with the Polish 1st Armored Division. So they cut off the Falais pocket because the armored divisions that could help punch their way out are at the whole other end of the sack, as they call it. Like they're 60 miles west. So that results in hundreds of thousands of Germans being captured.
I think it's 150,000 is what they say at the end. And as a result of this, Tsouras says the war is effectively over at this point, which
only enough time to motor over the Rhine, that they just drive. Which here's the thing. I think it would be a little bit more believable if it had said, the war ends December 44 or February 45, that because of this German, they make it to the German borders way quicker. The idea that the war is going to be over in like September of 1944, that it's just that there's just no German opposition, that everything's going to collapse, is a little hard to buy.
Right. Don't want to throw too much shade on Peter Tsouras, but
because it's a well-written story, and this is truly a lost opportunity, because if there was better coordination and perhaps a little less competition between the Allied forces, that this certainly could have saved lives and cut down on the length of the war. Whether it ends in August of September 44 is a different question.
There is something very neat in this. If you look in the footnotes, our boy Monty becomes Duke of Alamein, not just Viscount.
Yeah. And it says because the butcher bill of the war kind of goes down, he becomes Duke, which is pretty funny.
Does that mean he gets to be in the House of Lords?
Well, they're hereditary dukedoms, and yes. Well, he already was. When he was Viscount, he could still be in the House of Lords. His son, I think, is still, David Montgomery is still second Viscount Alamein. Yeah. Again, with the British making them Viscounts and Dukes and Earls of things.
Tunis.
That they don't, Earl Tunis, Harold Alexander. Tunisia, not a place that has ever been part of the British Empire. I mean, why not? Just call yourself, why don't you make him the Duke of Normandy? Sure, do whatever. Yeah. This is a good story, and I think it shows that this was a lost opportunity for sure.
Mm-hmm. Next story, the third story in this compilation, Patton and the Narrow Thrust, the Ardennes Route into Germany by James R. Arnold. And as that title might imply, this is kind of like, what if there was more of a single thrust philosophy rather than the wide front philosophy that Eisenhower espoused. And in this, Patton ends up doing all sorts of stuff. It's kind of written in more of a hard-nosed, like, action story kind of way. Very different from the first story and kind of the second one as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And the point is that instead of allowing Montgomery to do Market Garden, he sides with Patton, that they basically find that the Ardennes is not very well defended and there's a large fuel dump. Third Army just bum rushes from eastern France. So instead of attacking towards Metz and the fierce fighting that Patton had there in the fall and early winter of 44, they punch through, they go through Bastogne, go through Luxembourg, it's undefended, and they go into Germany and they cross the Rhine at Remagen, the famous Remagen Bridge in September of 44. So they're over the Rhine in September of 44. And the Germans launch Watch am Rhein, this offensive by the wonderfully named General Otto von Knobelsdorff. To try and stop him, but Patton puts paid to that, so he keeps advancing. It's an interesting story, kind of takes the Patton glory a little bit. There's funny, I think one of the fake footnotes talks about a book called Patton or Napoleon, who was the better general.
Yes, I do remember that, yeah. Also, Belton Cooper is a character in this story, the guy who wrote Death Traps, the book about how Shermans are the worst and they're terrible and whatnot. He's like a character and he's like inspecting a wrecked tank. Yes. And like, oh, this is just terrible.
And cleaning it out with all the... They have a very graphic description of what the inside of a tank looks like after it gets hit by a shell.
There's also some tank combat that happens at the end, and they do the whole, it takes 5 Shermans to take out 1 Tiger kind of thing that happens near the end.
Which, that's not entirely true.
No. I mean, wasn't there like a scout car that destroyed a Tiger tank during the Battle of the Bulge? I think it was like one of those Greyhound or whatever.
Maybe. I don't recall. Are you thinking of that Custer and the Waffen-SS book?
He took out a single action army and blew it up. Yeah.
And you have some goofy moments, like some sergeant takes a bunch of German generals hostage in a cafe and makes them like serve him drinks and stuff like that.
That's right. He shows up on a motorcycle and pulls out his Thompson. And then he's like ordered to go deliver some message to somebody. And he's like, well, I'm on my 4th beer, but okay. That's pretty great.
And then like a guy does a rebel yell while he's driving his tank. And
a Stuart tank specifically.
And he talks about the guy went to VMI and all that, which... Interestingly enough, George Marshall, who will become an important character later on in one of these later stories, not a graduate of West Point. He is a VMI graduate.
Interesting.
Which is fascinating to think that he was the highest ranked Army officer of the war, yet he never went to West Point.
But did he ever serve in combat in the First World War?
I think so. I think he was a staff officer. I think truly of the main American commanders in Europe, Patton was a combat veteran who fought as a tanker, but I think Bradley and Eisenhower actually were stateside. I mean, They were veterans technically.
He was at Gettysburg the entire war, I think.
Yeah, he was training soldiers. Eisenhower ran like an infantry school, so he actually never was deployed to France. Marshall, I think, was the chief of staff of a division in France. Mm-hmm. Before we go to the next story on this one is that this narrow thrust. Okay, there is a problem with this in my mind, which is, okay, great, they get over the Rhine, but are they going to just drive straight to Berlin? Is it going to be this one narrow patch of territory? I was kind of thinking like to defeat the Germans just because you get 4th and 6th armored over the Rhine in September of 44. Well, what's next? And they talk about it as if there's no German soldiers at all. It's that they haven't rebuilt. But at best, I guess maybe they can build a big bridgehead and you try and push the rest of Third Army and accelerate First Army. But like that still leaves a lot of territory. Remember, at this point, there's still big chunks of France that were under German control.
Yeah.
And interesting, the other day I was reading about Operation Nordwind, which was the German offensive in Lorraine in 45 and the Colmar Pocket. Like, there was still parts of France in 1945 that the Allies didn't control. Audie Murphy won his Medal of Honor in France in 1945. I mean, it wasn't much of France, but...
I think Dunkirk was occupied the entire war, wasn't it?
It was. And so was Saint-Nazaire and La Rochelle. The Channel Islands.
Oh, that's right. Guernsey.
There actually was not funny enough, there was actually a raid from the Channel Islands in like 1945. Some German soldiers like raided the Normandy coast and attacked like an American outpost near Avranches. And they actually killed some American troops, including, I believe, the only U.S. Marines to die in action in the Western Theater.
No way.
In Europe. Yeah.
Oh my God.
It was like a minor raid and they like retreated quickly. But yeah, they took E-boats and like dropped off.
I was about to ask, yeah.
But my problem with this story, other than it is very well written, and this guy hates, I think this guy was in the army and he hates logistical officers because every officer who's a logistician is like the worst ever. And then Montgomery is like just a dick, which, well, that, you know.
Well, yeah, that's correct.
Yeah, but he talks about Montgomery is writing his story, you know, the campaign account, it's Normandy to the Baltic, and here he like crosses out Baltic and writes North Sea.
That's right. And then JCH Lee.
Jesus Christ himself, Lee.
He's like, there's no way we can supply you over the Meuse. And then he crosses out and says the Rhine.
Yeah. Which is funny because there's the old saying about amateur study tactics, like semi-professional study strategy, and then professional study logistics.
It's all about logistics.
Yeah, well, let's get on to the next one, which is one of my favorites.
It's one that you've mentioned before. During our Market Garden episode, you mentioned A Backdoor into Germany, Monty Bounces the Rhine by Andrew Ufendel.
And I think of all the alternate history stories I have read, this actually may be my favorite because this reads indistinguishable from a real history book.
Yes.
And to me, this is like the ultimate in believability for an alternate history story because everything that happens in this seems very plausible, realistic, and supportable.
Like, for instance, they talk about how the landing sites change. They're closer to the city of Arnhem.
So I guess the basic diversion is that Robert Urquhart and other officers too insist that the landing sites are too far away from Arnhem and Market Garden, that they need to land closer. So the British 1st Airborne needs to land closer to the city. So instead of landing about 8 miles away near what's called Wolf Haze and having to march this distance by glider and by paratroopers, they do a glider, what they call coup de main, like where they have, it's sort of like Pegasus Bridge, where the gliders like land right at the bridge. They take all the bridges, and there's a road bridge, a railroad bridge, and a pontoon bridge they take. But the paratroopers land just south of the famous bridge. And so basically, instead of one battalion under John Frost, that's who Anthony Hopkins plays.
In the film A Bridge Too Far.
A Bridge Too Far, not in real life.
To be clear.
Yes. So basically what happens is that because of their greater numbers, they're able to hold out against the German attacks, and they hold on long enough for 30th Corps to relieve them. So, and then it goes through that they expand this hold over the Rhine a little bit, but not much because they get caught in this urban fighting.
Because that's what they're going to do. The Germans are going to counterattack and not just let them run all the way to the Jesselmeer.
Exactly. And so what happens is that So there is a hold over the Rhine. The Allies have bounced the Rhine, but their lines have been dragged northward. There's a lot of arguing. Then Monty dies in a plane crash, and Harold Alexander becomes the commander of 21st Army Group.
Yes.
In that he has much better relationships with the Americans.
But who's in charge of Italy now?
I don't know. Mark Clark.
Mark Clark, yes.
Mark Clark.
Future Korean War general, Mark Clark.
Nah, I don't know if he was in Korea. Was he in Korea?
I thought he was.
Maybe. Future president of the Citadel.
Really?
The university, absolutely.
I know people give him a hard time for taking Rome because it was like an open city and there was no resistance, and he let a bunch of Germans get away. I remember that from
Day of Battle.
Day of Battle, that's it, yeah. And just like, oh, this guy's the biggest idiot ever. What a moron.
He was an interesting character. But point is in this is that The diversion after this is obviously Alexander's in command. So there's a couple things. One, it talks about how Antwerp isn't open until December the 7th because it takes additional time because their lines have been stretched to clear out that area, which is interesting because Antwerp was opened earlier than that in real life.
Huh.
So it was opened in late November.
Allows for a little bit of randomness. Not every advantage leads to...
Exactly that. By getting over the Rhine, we had to neglect clearing out the Scheldt estuary.
The Canadians did that in real life.
They did, and I think they do the same thing here. But they also talk about in the story that Battle of the Bulge, they say that the Germans attack and they're checked in the streets of Dinant, which is a Belgian city. I haven't measured out the miles, but it's a few miles farther than they got in real life. They did not make it to Dinant itself. But point is that because the lines have been stretched a little bit farther north, they make a little bit more of a penetration. But the Allies counterattack, and because they like Alexander so much, the Americans, they work well with him and they cut off the Bulge.
Nice.
And because of that, they get to the Rhine quicker in other places. And long story short, the Allies get to Berlin and take Berlin in April of 45 before the Russians.
Mm-hmm. So pretty close to when the war actually ended, but still.
Yeah, and it's funny, in one of the fake footnotes, it talks about, like, this is a close run thing, and were the Allies, Western Allies, destined to take Berlin? But they said probably not. The Russians were closer. A few days could have made a difference. And in here, they have a few days advantage. And there's some differences in, like, where there's Operation Veritable, which was the real campaign that Montgomery launched in 45 to clear the Rhine area. There's more of a fighting in the Netherlands and stuff like that. But
there's also some excellent fake footnotes inside of here.
Yes.
So wonderful. Cornelius Ryan has more than one book that he writes in there. One of them is the one about Market Garden is called A Bridge to Glory, which is fantastic. That's wonderful.
Perfect.
And then he also wrote one about the Allies taking Berlin.
It's like the last battle.
Yeah, something like that.
They talk about how, so it's interesting. So not only do the Allies capture Berlin, but Hitler is arrested by his generals and they turn him over to the Americans and the British. But Albert Speer, instead of living to 1980, is hanged from a light post, and Martin Bormann is eaten by a lion.
I forgot about that. Yeah, he is eaten by a lion, isn't he? It's like The Happening. Ever see that movie?
No.
Oh, it's a terrible film.
But I've been talking a lot, so Max, why don't you? I want you to get in to talk too.
There's some people who say that Speer should have been executed because of all the bad stuff that he did during World War II. But he was smarter during Nuremberg, didn't antagonize the judges as much as other people, so he was able to get away with it. And then appear in The World at War as a interviewee.
That's right, he is. And so was Karl Dönitz, too.
Yeah, that thing's awesome. But yeah, another cool fake footnote is that Andrew Ufendel himself is in the footnotes.
Yes, this is a great one.
It's like analyzing alternatives that could have happened, and it says, for an example of this, see Andrew Ufendel's story, Disaster at Arnhem, Monty fails to bounce the Rhine, in Peter Tsouras' Battle of the Bulge.
Yeah, an alternative history, which is hilarious that it has. Basically, it's referencing our reality. I love that. That's great. That's an awesome fake footnote.
That's wonderful.
I just like this story a lot because this feels real, and it's written super well. It reads well, but it's funny, in the book, they always have these compilation of pictures, and then it references the stories and talks about it. But one, it shows a picture of what's now the John Frost Bridge and says it's known as the John Hackett Bridge there because John Hackett was a brigade commander. But in this story, because the whole brigade makes it to the bridge rather than just Frost's battalion, the bridge is named after him. And
that's great.
I know, isn't that crazy?
What a good bit of thought that went into that.
Yeah, so instead of the John Frost Brugge, it's the John Hackett.
Wow.
Which is really cool. The bridge there, it does exist there. I've also have been there. Pretty cool. It looks exactly the same. It is not the original. The original was destroyed.
Yeah.
And also Arnhem, another city, completely destroyed. Looks super modern and all that.
Did they film the film A Bridge Too Far there or somewhere else?
It was filmed on scene.
Okay.
On site.
Did they at least try to make it look like the old city, or?
Yeah, they did. But this is also, it was filmed in the 70s, so there's been a lot of growth since then. So
Yeah. It really makes me wonder if somebody took the time and effort to make one of those 1970s style epic World War II films, you could do so much with CGI that you could never do before.
Absolutely.
You could accurately show things without completely blowing out the budget, or there's just no
using
locations.
Patton tanks.
proper tanks.
And they use a Leopard tank in the Bridge Too Far.
That's right. Yeah, on the bridge, right? Where it's it's like pushing all those burning scout cars.
Yeah, that's a Leopard. That's a Leopard 1, like a modified. Like they put some stuff over.
Fantastic.
It's okay. Let's get the next one.
The next story is The Race to Bastogne. Nuts. All of these stories have two titles. There's like the main title and then there's like a lower title by Christopher Anderson. And so I'll just take a side note here to say real quick that I read this book, but I also listened to the audiobook version. And they don't say Bastogne in the audiobook. They say Bastogne, which I think might be the correct way of pronouncing it in like Belgian. But like...
I don't, I've been there as well. I don't remember. I feel like they said Bastogne when I was there, but this has been a couple years, so my memory is not. But I don't know.
Plus, this guy also calls him Peter Tsouras, so I don't know. Nah. That doesn't seem right to me.
No, it's Tsouras.
Tsouras. Consult the thesaurus, Tsouras. But I'll defer a little bit more to you on this.
So this one we won't spend a whole lot of time on. So long story short is that in real life, so the 82nd and 101st were dispatched to delay the Germans as they push into the Bulge, as they create the Bulge. The 82nd goes farther north, so they are not as famous as the 101st at Bastogne, but they certainly fought hard. The point is that in this story, 101st Airborne was originally ordered to go to a town called, I think it's Verbemont, in Belgium. But just by happenstance, they were actually redirected to where they're supposed to go, Bastogne. But in this story, that doesn't happen. So the 101st is out of position. They don't really get to Bastogne in time. They never really get to hold the city. They get pushed back.
And the Germans get there first.
Mm-hmm. And the Germans, well, there were American troops in Bastogne before the 101st. There was a combat command in the 9th and 10th Armored Divisions. But point is without the paratroopers and the glider infantry to back them up, they can't really hold Bastogne and they have to fall back. The Bulge is much more secure. And because of that, the Allies ask for more Soviet help. Mm-hmm. And then Stalin decides that he's just been betrayed too much. So he's going to reach an armistice with the Germans.
With Hitler.
And I think the line is, we're going to stop for the good of the Russian people.
Well, first of all, the Soviet Union is a lot more than just Russia.
Yes,
Belarus,
or Soviet people, whatever.
Ukraine, I think it does say Russian
I use them
people.
interchangeably, but I shouldn't, and I know.
No. I think it's a flaw of the story. But that's insane. Why would Stalin stop? Mm-hmm. I think there actually was some talk of a separate peace, like there are secret peace feelers around the time Kursk happened.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, through Sweden, right?
Yeah, but this is not that. Like I really don't understand the rationale there.
Yeah, which is strange. So this apparently happens, and it ends with the Allies regrouping and getting ready to plan for 45. So, when you look at the fake footnotes, you'd think you'd see some mention of like, well, Berlin doesn't fall until August or September of 1945. But no, here, let's, because some of these really stood out. Let's see, fake footnotes. Joseph Goebbels, The Triumph of Faith, Der Angriff, Berlin, 1947. Hasso von Manteuffel, From Egypt to England, Panzer Publishing, Heidelberg, 1954.
Panzer Publishing.
Gerd von Rundstedt, All for the Führer, Der Angriff, 1948. 24. Oswald Mosley, The End of the Western Alliance, Black Shirt Books, London, 1954. Okay, so let's address this.
So this means that the Germans roll back the alliance all the way to the sea and then attacks Britain.
So again. 1945, here comes Operation Sea Lion. We're back. And now we've got Panthers.
And Me-262s as well. God so, I mean,
almighty.
They didn't have that back in 41. So,
yeah.
So now.
Oh, God, this is just, okay. First of all, Mr. Anderson, good job. No, but that's an entertaining footnotes. Yeah. Those are one hell of some fake footnotes.
The mind reels contemplating how fake this footnote is.
I know, truly. It's amazing. It's got what a great footnote should have, which is an awesome title. But it just has to be said.
Okay.
That's not believable, because I don't find that the Germans are going to roll back the Allies in December of 44 after the Allies have breached the Western Wall?
What is going to stop Stalin from saying, actually, I was just kidding,
Yeah,
and then
now
restarting it?
Yeah, once you guys have sent all your panzers out to the West to launch another offensive that's apparently going to drive them back.
What's happening in Japan is what I'm wondering.
Yeah. Well, here's the thing: is this is perhaps me being too realistic, being the spoil sport of this. But I know how this would act. How I feel like this would play out. The war is going to get a lot tougher for the Allies. But guess what? So that planned offensive they're going to launch in Italy in 45. Okay, the Allies were going to just go on the defensive in Italy. They're going to strip additional American and British units, and those are going to go to the Western Front. They're going to accelerate the pace of new divisions going to the Western Front. The Pacific War is going to slow down. That's going to be stopped. And any additional troops that may be going for the invasion of Okinawa and stuff now are going to get sent to the Western Front. They're going to increase the bomber campaign, maybe B-29s.
Yeah.
Oh, and by the way, let's say the Germans held out until, I don't know, August 6th of 1945, perhaps. And they're apparently in the position where they're rolling the Allies back. I think there's a surprise coming their way.
Yes.
Brighter than 1,000 suns, perhaps.
It's that story about, what was the name of that story? It was from Alternate.
Vadi.
Yeah.
Vadi, yeah.
What a great story.
Dawn came brighter than 1,000 suns to Dresden. So yeah, that's my problem is that I don't think the Western Allies, I saw a while back, there were some people who were commenting like, oh, you're just all pro-Russian or something because you talk about how great the Russians are. Well, I'm going to say to the point that the Western Allies could have beaten the Germans at this point. If this is January of 1945 and the Bulge still kind of exists and the Russians have reached an armistice, America and Britain are going to defeat the Germans. It's going to take longer, perhaps more into 45, and perhaps that means a whole lot worse problems for people who are in captivity in Germany. But the idea that Germans are going to win, sorry, good fake footnote, not plausible. What do you think, Max?
Just keep bombing the hell out of all of their cities, burn every single city. Plus, they have to leave people on the Eastern Front because, like I was saying earlier, don't trust that Joseph Stalin is going to honor this sacred agreement between the two of you. This has already been betrayed once in the past. There's no reason why it can't be betrayed again. Yeah. So, I mean, it's not like everyone from the Eastern Front can suddenly be transferred to the Western Front. You have the forces of France that you can now call upon. You know, like, I just don't think so.
Charles de Gaulle to the rescue.
Charles de Gaulle to the rescue, yes. Which he does in a later story.
Yes.
Yeah. But yeah, it's a bit silly. But you know what? That's the place to do silly things like that is the footnotes. Just to kind of get your noggin jogging a little bit.
Absolutely. Okay, well, let's get to the next story.
Blunting the Bulge. From the Maz to the Miz. How do you pronounce this?
Mers.
With the 1st Canadian Army by Sean M. Maloney. I love this guy.
He's back.
This guy was in Cold War hot. He did that story where like there was the Quebec.
Yes. They were the Americans are sending troops to Quebec.
The Sikh battalions.
The Ministry of Truth.
That guy gets thrown in a cement mixer at some point in that story.
Oh, God.
What a great story that was. And this is a pretty cool story, too. So something about Sean M. Maloney is that he's from Canada.
Yes.
And he's a big fan of Canada. He likes Canada a great deal.
Canada.
My Canada. And there's nothing wrong with that. I like that. I think that's great.
I guess basically the divergence here is that there's an operation launched that attacks Patton's headquarters. It's Operation Greif, I guess as they call it, which was this feared thing where the Germans, infiltrated German troops dressed as Americans. They're supposedly going to go and assassinate Eisenhower.
As seen in the film, The Battle of the Bulge.
Yes, that's right. But
the documentary Battle of the Bulge, that's 100% accurate.
Exactly. I didn't know there was so much sand in Belgium.
It's the Spanish part of Belgium.
Yeah, the Spanish, exactly. But in this, basically, they launch this attack on Patton's headquarters and kill most of the high-up staff of the Third Army. And Patton gets killed by a captured Thunderbolt, machine guns him in a car.
That's right, yeah. They Yamamoto'd him, basically.
They did, yes. Third Army is basically completely ineffectual. Because of that, Bastogne falls, and the Germans drive much farther. They get over the Meuse River at certain points, and it takes the 1st Canadian Army basically just leaves its positions and headlong attacks the Germans, and they stop them around Namur and Charleroi.
I love the way it's written because it talks about, like, once again, the Canadians are called to do the other allies' dirty work.
Yeah, basically the Americans and the British soldiers are like completely ineffective in this. But only, it's those Canadians who are just...
Sean Maloney insults the Third Army's radio discipline at several points throughout the story. Like, that's the reason why Patton gets killed. It's because they intercept a transmission saying, I'm moving from here to here. Mm-hmm. And that's how they kill him.
And they beat back the German attack, and then the war apparently continues on as normal.
And they're tasked with clearing up the right flank or whatever.
The left flank, yeah.
Yeah, they're put into the sideshow again.
To drive up and take the coast of Holland. Mm. But yeah, it's just, it's fine. But yeah, it seems like, I feel like Sean Maloney like dresses up in like a Mountie costume and is like, I mean, save the Allies.
I gotta say, when I was growing up, I didn't have a ton of respect for the nation of Canada, mostly because it was just made fun of endlessly in media.
Yeah, Dudley Do Right.
South Park made fun of Canada. And also, probably the most damning is Canadians make fun of Canada all the time. They're like, oh, I'm from Canada. Oh, it's so lame. And But there's no reason to do that. Canada is a great country with a great history, and people from Canada should be proud to be Canadian.
Very accomplished soldiers in World War I and World War II. And I'm glad that you read about the first Canadian Army, which really does get short shrift in military histories. There is this one fake footnote. Jan Haglundin, Great Allied War Atrocities, Another View. New Stasi Verlag.
What?
That's like supposed to be the publisher. That's pretty funny.
Sean M. Maloney himself is a Canadian veteran. He was in Afghanistan.
Was he? Oh, cool.
Yes.
Hugh Ernest Rextian, The Dead Die Harder, The SAS in Northwest Europe, 1944 to 45. Virgin Exploitative Books, London.
Huh.
Oh, Richard Branson really went crazy there.
S.M. Sterling is like, this sounds like an interesting publisher for me.
Good stuff. Next one, Go Home. This is our goddamn show. Monty pulls it off.
Monty pulls something off, yes. So this is like basically if Monty was a little bit more tactful and didn't alienate people so much. But once again, Matt, a lot of the details are lost on me. So,
yes. So basically what happens is that in this battle, so if you look at, and I'm sure this is a good time to put up a picture of the Bulge, is that you'll see how the main drive of the Bulge was you had 6th SS Panzer Army in the north, 5th Panzer Army in the center, 7th Army in the south. 7th Army fights primarily in Luxembourg. 6th Panzer Army, that's Malmedy, Stavelot, St. Vith, Tross Points, all that fighting on the Elsenborn Ridge, things like that. If you look at it, the 5th Panzer Army, they go kind of straight across. Well, in this one, the Germans decide to hook right and drive with both 6th SS Panzer and 5th Panzer Army towards Liège and to try and get bridges over the Meuse there. In this one, basically, Montgomery plans this counterattack, and it's how do the Allies deal with this? Matthew Ridgway, he has a miscalculation, and some of his units get chewed up, and there's this special battalion of Norwegian American troops that delay the Germans long enough to get a counterattack by both the British 11th Armored Division and then by J. Lawton Collins' 7th Corps also counterattack with 3rd Armored Division. So long story short is that Bastogne is not as important here because the main force is hooking right rather than going straight. So long story short is that they stop the Germans. Nothing seems to be very much different other than Ridgway. The 82nd Airborne is pretty beat up pretty bad. It says it can't fight for the rest of the war, which is it did fight for the rest of the war in reality. Ridgway gets relieved from command, but instead gets sent out to command for the Japanese invasion, which never happens.
Right, because they mentioned that the atomic bombs still happen. So,
and basically Montgomery is he gets ambushed at one point by these German soldiers, but he survives. And it is funny in the fake footnotes. There's not many, but there's one because it basically talks about how the British are like, we saved you Americans again. And here are some of the stories about the American and British back and forth books. Michael Siggins, Saved by the Cavalry, London. Stephen Kosakowski, Betrayed by Montgomery. John Foppington, Chaos, The American Way of War.
Foppington, eh?
I know, Foppington. Yeah, I love that. It's little nuggets like that really make these books great.
Is it this story that basically Monty doesn't give the press conference he gave in real life where he
Yes.
kind of sort of insults the Americans and pissed off Bradley and Patton to the point of just being inconsolable? Just like, I can't talk to that guy.
And it mentions in the story that like that apparently Churchill like secretly, in this version, secretly flies to like Brussels and tells Montgomery like, you need to not be such a dick.
Who was the guy that came out? Freddie DeGangon.
Yeah, Freddie.
He does the press conference instead.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, this is interesting, but it's very, you really have to like, I had to reread this story because I've read this book before, but I had to reread it before we did it because I couldn't really remember what the difference was. So next is Operation Herbstnebel.
Which I think means autumn mist.
Yes, smoke over the Ardennes. But yes, it means autumn mist.
Different from arbor mist. Not quite the same.
I guess so. So the point of this one, this is another really nose to the grindstone kind of.
I read it just a few days ago, and I really struggled to remember what was different about this story.
So basically what this is that the planning for the Bulge is different, and the German sort of operational deception programs they put into place are more successful, and they have basically a clearer plan for the Bulge, and it's more thought out. And Hitler's objective is not to capture Antwerp. It's to damage the Allies enough to maybe break them apart. So there's a really good map. You have to look at like the Herbstnebel map in the book that shows what's different. So basically, they're more successful in the early days of the campaign. So what he says is I slow down the Allied response a little bit, so it's behind by a day or so. But in the Bulge, that's a big difference because Battle of the Bulge starts December 16th, 44. Like a place like Bastogne, the siege of Bastogne starts December 20th, 1944. But a day or two off, and the Allies are in a much worse position. So Jochen Peiper's troops make more headway in the north. So instead of, again, attacking straight towards Rochefort, Salais, and Dinant, they kind of do this right kind of hook thing. Because they take the Allies a bit more by surprise, the response is delayed. Sort of the northern part of the Bulge solidifies. But they talk about a German paratrooper landing at Barak Michel, which in real life was an absolute disaster. But in this one, it's better. And also it says how they managed to slip like half a dozen King Tiger tanks managed to break through the line to get to the paratroopers. So it takes U.S. 1st Infantry and U.S. 30th Infantry Division a couple extra days to get in line near a place called Stavelot in L'Église, which in real life, the 30th Infantry Division did a lot of damage to Jochen Peiper's troops, but in this place, they're not. The 82nd and 101st Airborne, they fight these like delaying battles to stop the Germans. So the 101st never makes it to Bastogne because it's taken before they get there, but they fought at a place called Orthaville in Champion. The 82nd basically fights at a place called Monhaye and Verbemont and delays the Germans enough so that by the time they actually get bridgeheads over the Meuse at Liège, and then the British counterattack and stop them. But there's a fun part with the 101st where it talks about how they're getting pressed on three sides by the Germans, and the Germans say you need to surrender, and Anthony McAuliffe says nuts. And it says like the paratroopers like are electric with energy, and the next German assault, they lose 4 Panthers and they make no headway, and like the Americans actually like counterattack and like push them back. So I love that part. And then what the Germans do is instead of kind of remaining in the Bulge and fighting this battle over the leftovers in January of 45 is they retreat. They do an orderly retreat back before a counterattack can cut them off. And then Patton's counterattack is not as strong here. So long story short is that the Americans lose more troops, the British lose more troops, the Germans lose less troops. And he says the story ends with talking about that German morale goes up and that the Lorraine offensive is more successful. On balance, this is the last line. On balance, the Herbstnebel campaign gained Hitler perhaps 3 or 4 extra months for his 1,000-year Reich to live. The results were far from what he had anticipated.
I do remember that part, yeah.
So basically, the Germans last a little bit longer, which, again, if you're still standing in August of 45, they're still going to nuke you. So,
Plan B.
Exactly.
So there's a city called Barak Michel, like Barack Obama and Michelle Obama.
No, not spell. Here,
No,
I'll spell
I know.
it. Yeah, but probably mispronouncing it. Barak Michel, Barak de Freitur, Trois Points, Stoumont, Iowale, Werbemont, St. Hubert, Houffalize, Snowville, Clairvaux, Eschweiler, Wiltz, St. Vith, Vielsalm, these sorts of things.
We are not French.
We are not, no.
French people.
But this is Wallonia, the part of Belgium that speaks French.
Yeah.
And parts of it, actually around like Malmedy and stuff, speak German. And then you go, most of them are actually Flemish. I did not realize that most Belgian people are Flemish. They actually speak Dutch.
Interesting.
Interesting. But yeah, so this one's very nose to the grindstone. This is more about what is the best tactical situation the Germans could get out of the Bulge.
Well, what about the next story? That's another good tactical situation. Sort of, kind of.
Oh, yes.
A little bit.
Holding Patton, 7th Panzer Army in the Battle of Luxembourg.
Luxembourg, finally.
Luxembourg.
Yes, written by Kim H. Campbell.
Don't know who he is.
Don't know. Or she. It could be a woman.
Yes.
Who knows? There's a very small chance that a woman wrote this story, but who knows? Luxembourg. Did any actual fighting occur in Luxembourg?
Guy, Kim H. Campbell, was a regular officer in the U.S. Army. For the last 13 years, he has been a senior intelligence analyst.
Well, there you go.
There you go. Question answered.
Did any actual fighting occur in Luxembourg?
Yes, a lot did. The 4th Infantry Division held that line. And, well, there's a huge U.S. cemetery there.
Oh.
That's where one of my relatives is buried who was killed in the Battle of the Bulge. She was actually killed in Luxembourg.
Oh, my God.
Mm-hmm.
I know the Germans used the V3 cannon on Luxembourg.
Luxembourg City.
That's right. You betrayed us.
Let's just hope that the Allies put all their troops right where this cannon points. And then we'll be good. We've got them.
Got them.
Mission accomplished, ladies and gentlemen.
All that money and time and effort totally pays off now. Static defenses in a war of maneuver. That's really smart. That works out great.
So, but the point of this one is that Erich Brandenburg was the commander of what was called 7th Army. Mm-hmm. And that was mostly infantry, almost no panzer units. So they did not really make much headway. They kind of broke through parts of the 4th Infantry Division, but were contained pretty well. Mm-hmm. In this one, he convinces them that Patton is going to attack the Bulge, and I need extra infantry and extra tanks. And he does. Mm-hmm. And he gets a mountain division.
The, what is it, the 6th SS Nord or something?
Gebirgs. Gebriggs. Sorry, whatever. It's a mountain division.
Right.
And then he gets 2 panzer divisions to support him. And basically, he's more successful in Luxembourg and drives into Luxembourg City itself, where 3rd Army fights, they call it Stalingrad West, like a house-to-house battle with the Germans. But basically what it does is it sucks away the strength. Throughout the story, it talks about how Patton is trying to drive towards Bastogne, but he has to ship off. So 4th Armored, instead of going to Bastogne, has to peel off to fight in Luxembourg. 80th Infantry, another division that went to Bastogne, has to peel off and fight in Luxembourg again. So the point is that they sap the strength enough to where Bastogne, it's January of 45, Bastogne hasn't been relieved, and they have to evacuate Bastogne. And ultimately, the Bulge does fall. The Allies reduce it, but it takes longer. Patton takes more casualties. And because of the delay, by the time they reach the Rhine, the bridge at Remagen's been blown. So they have to launch an assault crossing. And because of that, the Soviets conquer more of Germany. And it talks about how they get to Munich 2 hours before the Russians, which is not true in real life.
Varsity plunder happened over the Rhine, but where?
More near a place called Wesel, which is kind of in northwestern Germany near the Dutch border. Last airborne operation of the war. 17th Airborne and British 6th Airborne. I love the names of operations. Varsity plunder.
Varsity plunder. Anvil Dragoon is the best one.
Anvil Dragoon. Operation Shoestring. That's Guadalcanal.
Shingle. That was, what was it, Anzio or something?
Yeah, Anzio Shingle. But yeah, so the point of this is a pretty realistic one. And it talks about how this is actually kind of worse for the Germans in the long run, because it talks about the parts of Germany the Allies were supposed to take. By the time they're evacuated by the Russians, they've been stripped of its population. The Russians have apparently decided we're going to ship everyone back to East Germany.
They don't leave until
46.
46, yeah. The Western occupation zones.
So this is an interesting one, but Max, we got to get to the last one.
The last one, and clearly the best one.
This is where it all goes off the rails in the most amazing way.
Oh my God.
Max, I'm going to let you lead on this one.
The Ardennes disaster. The Iron Curtain falls on the White House by Peter G. Tsouras.
Tsouras,
right, yes. My favorite dinosaur, the Tsouras. So the Germans take Antwerp. How? Don't worry about it. They just do. They took Antwerp. So now the Western Allies are cut in half. There's something in the north called the Holland Pocket that has literally 1 million soldiers inside of it. And things are very, very dire. Eisenhower has been fired, for one, and things are in a great state of flux. If I remember correctly, I believe the Pacific is put on hold and Douglas MacArthur gets transferred to take over in the West.
Well, actually, what happens is that Eisenhower gets sacked. George Marshall is coming to take over, but those nasty Soviets, they've just been scheming.
Right before Marshall goes across the ocean, he has a meeting with a Hoover, and walks into the office. The book says it's Herbert Hoover, but he's the head of the FBI, so I'm pretty sure Peter actually meant J. Edgar Hoover, because that makes no sense at all otherwise.
Well, maybe it's intentional. Maybe because Herbert Hoover became the head of the FBI, that somehow led to Antwerp being captured by the Germans.
Right. Things have gone so awry. I mean, if you set the point of divergence far enough in the past, anything's possible. Or maybe it's Herbert Edgar Hoover and the J is silent. Who knows? Anything's possible. But anyway, Herbert Hoover tells George Marshall that the president, which I should also say that when the Germans took Antwerp, Franklin Delano Roosevelt heard about this and immediately had a stroke, kind of like in that TV show Deep Blue Fleet. He gets such bad news that he just instantly dies. And who becomes president, Matt?
Henry Wallace, because this happens before January 20th of 45. So Henry Wallace becomes the president.
Yes.
He decides that in this state of emergency, for the good of the nation, for the good of the Soviet nation.
Oh, my God. He's a red. Red is in the White House. Oh, no.
I think Tsouras doesn't really like communists. Because they always come off as like, it's sort of like how in that story about like Rommel, the Saint Rommel story where he stops the Russians are just like, that's the same thing here. I half expected at the end, Zhukov, Stalin, and Beria were going to get together and go,
They all start drinking blood from chalices.
Yeah, exactly. So basically they take over. They basically decide, Henry Wallace, they never say if he's directly a communist agent, but I guess at best a stooge, but he kind of seems like one.
Yeah, they kind of say that he's surrounded by communists and that he's just like this weak sister that gets taken along, but it's not really made clear.
People like Dexter White becomes the Secretary of the Treasury.
Alger Hiss
is like his chief advisor, and then Duncan Lee is like high in the OSS, all people who later turned out to be Soviet agents that were revealed later in the Cold War. And they talk about how Henry Wallace doesn't care about how the war is going as long as the Lend-Lease shipments are increased to Russia.
More, yes.
More Lee tanks. We're going to send you more Lee tanks.
More Airacobras, yes.
Yes. Now we're going to send you King Cobras, the P-63. But the point is that, so Wallace has this meeting, Marshall has this meeting, but Duncan Lee is recording it.
Yeah.
And then they decide they got to take care of him. So his plane blows up on its way to Europe. And then Douglas MacArthur gets recalled from the Philippines to save America.
Yes. La Marshal.
He comes and...
Marshal of the Philippines.
He was. Field Marshal of the Philippines. So point is that the Allies, there's this Holland pocket where there's like 1 million troops captured. And there's an interesting line where it talks about the great waves of resupply planes that become fodder for the new German jet planes. I was like, God.
Yes.
And long story short is Patton launches this last ditch offensive that indeed cuts through the Holland pocket. And then he and MacArthur, they go to go save America from Wallace.
Yeah, they go back to the United States and they do Bonus Army 2.0 because in addition to Wallace, there's also like all these like communist agitator volunteers.
Soldier and sailors committees for Wallace. That's what they're called. People's committees for Wallace.
Yeah,
like
they all wear armbands and whatnot.
And they beat up Robert Jackson, the Supreme Court justice.
Oh, no.
They put Harry Truman under house arrest for his own safety. They refuse to watch the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier.
That's right, yes.
And then Charles de Gaulle goes apeshit on the French resistance to call out the communists.
He executes Order 66 on the French resistance, which would probably kill the entire French resistance. They're all dead now.
Yeah.
Because they start doing sabotage. I know we keep jumping back and forth time-wise, but like during this whole trying to relieve the Holland pocket thing, like the supply lines are being attacked by communists because the Soviets want to delay things as much as possible while they lure Hitler into moving divisions to the west.
So they can counterattack.
So they just roll them up super fast. Yeah. Also, they mentioned that Wallace sends over information on the Manhattan Project to the Soviets, which doesn't really come up later, but like,
yeah, it doesn't seem to have any.
Because it takes a long time to make a nuclear weapon. You can't just do it like that.
Exactly.
I mean, come on.
So Patton heads back with MacArthur with troops from the 3rd Infantry Division, and him and Audie Murphy like take command of the.
J. Edgar Hoover's there too. I'm sorry, Herbert Hoover is there as well.
Yeah, and he leads a special team of FBI agents to take back the White House. Here, let me just read because it's like. The Congress Republicans and most of the Democrats were against the Wallaceites, the Progressive Party, stalking horse for the Communist Party, USA, and now senior levels of the armed forces. The Wallacite thugs have been reinforced by gangs of the so-called soldiers and sailor councils, culled from various stateside posts and camps. The thugs made up of stockade leavings and the impressionable. Yeah, Audie Murphy helps FBI agents and Hoover take over the White House and take Henry Wallace, and all that Hoover says is, Henry Wallace, you are under arrest for treason.
Against the state of Nebraska. How dare you.
Right. And then MacArthur, I guess Truman gets sworn in, and then I love this about there's a picture taken of MacArthur with Truman that says, Constitution saved. Truman thanks MacArthur. And then there is some amazing footnotes, fake footnotes.
Well, I remember one of the things is that when Duncan Lee is like opening his briefcase with the recording and device inside of it, he looks up to a portrait of Robert E. Lee on the wall and smiles to like introduce the fact that he's a descendant of Robert E. Lee. And in the fake footnotes, there's a book written about him. It's like The Life of Duncan H. Lee, A Legacy Betrayed or something, written by William H. Longstreet. What?
Yes.
Presumably a descendant of the General Longstreet in the Civil War.
Oh, yes. George Patton, One Day in April. Oliver and Stone, Los Angeles, 1949.
I did notice that, yeah.
This is a book. I wanted to read. Some of these fake footnotes seem really interesting, but truly, we have to write this book if it doesn't exist. Robert C. Lowry, How Douglas MacArthur Saved the Constitution.
Yes. Yes. Ha-ha.
Yes. Oh, my God. But this is great. And I like that Tsouras goes after a lot of, some of these stories, the Herbst-Nabel and the Monty bounces the Rhine. These are realistic as they get. You get something a little bit more fanciful, a little bit more.
Go totally all out. And that's what I like. It's like in Red Lightning. That's the most ridiculous
This is the
story.
Red Lightning of this book.
just go completely nuts.
Because I do think it's a bold choice where he's like, I'm not even going to explain how Antwerp was taken. It just happened.
It just happens. Well, hey, I don't know, maybe tens of thousands of German soldiers were able to escape the Stalingrad pocket or something, and they were freed up in the West later. And then who knows? I don't know. Anything's possible.
The possibilities are endless, Max.
Possibilities are endless.
A Jewish Genghis Khan joined the German soldiers, and he led them in his Panther tank to.
Well, you see, Constant Rebecque disobeyed Wellington's order of blah, 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 and didn't abandon Quatre Bras. And then that's what happened.
The butterfly effect that somehow led to. It talks about that the Germans apparently seem to just race with like jet engines across Belgium, because it talks about how the strategic reserve for Patton's forces is the 18th Airborne Corps, that the airborne divisions never managed to even get involved. So apparently they drove so fast that 82nd and 101st Airborne just kind of sat there and was like, ugh.
Plus, you got 1 million guys, right? You'd think you could make a Schwerpunkt that could just break out and rejoin the rest of them.
Well, that's the thing is that it's not like the Germans were like a line of Tiger tanks from Antwerp to the German border. Clearly, Montgomery would, in a case like that where it looks like he's getting cut off, and the parts of the 1st and 9th U.S. armies that were there too, they would turn two directions. They would turn some of their forces south and attack, and they would clearly get through. That line would be very porous, and they were clearly large amounts of troops and tanks were going to be able to cut their way through. Maybe not in a very organized fashion, but they were probably going to be able to cut. So what that you have troops in Antwerp? If you don't have a line continually running from Antwerp back. That doesn't matter if you have American troops or British troops, cutting through that line and getting to the other side.
Though, to be fair, you don't get the resupply from Antwerp. You don't get the supply lines from there anymore. Mm-hmm. But yeah, there's a lot of assumptions that get made that are never really dwelled on at the beginning of this story to explain why things are the way they are.
I know, because that's something we didn't really talk about, the basis, the facts, the underlying facts of the Battle of the Bulge, but the Germans launch a counteroffensive against the 1st U.S. Army in the Ardennes, which was an area where divisions were resting after heavy fighting in other areas of the front, namely the Hurtgen Forest. They penetrate relatively far, but not crazily. The German goal officially was Antwerp, which is just not going to happen.
Not going to happen.
You have here the fact that they get to Antwerp. I think this is the way you do it. You have to be like, okay, this has been accomplished. Now let's talk about the story rather than try and explain that, because there's going to be no world in which that makes sense.
The whole story would be about them accomplishing that, and just skip that part. So, something else that happened in this story. Hitler gets murdered by Sepp Dietrich in this story. Yeah.
Lured out of his bunker and shot to death. But here it's at Ziegenberg, which is in the west rather than farther in the east. But it's... Yeah. This is a fun one. This is a fun story.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of a Southern strategy. Similar in that you have this nominal American politician that was never president and never really did a whole lot, suddenly being thrust into this crazy situation that's totally silly.
And just a complete stooge for the Soviets.
Yeah.
It's interesting. And this is a very overall, I think, a strong collection of stories.
Henry Wallace, did you know that he was involved in the Theosophist movement?
Really?
Yes. Yeah.
Did not know that.
Passed when it was super weird. It was already weird in the 1880s. To still be doing that crap in the 1940s and 50s is whoa.
That's strange. Yeah, no, he's a very intriguing figure. I don't know as much about him, but what I do know is it's strange that he was vice president.
I think he was out and out a proponent of increasing relations with the Soviet Union. And
for sure.
That's kind of why he's the Soviet patsy in this story.
He ran for president in 1948.
On the Progressive Party ticket, which apparently is a stalking horse for the Communist Party, according to Peter Tsouras.
Yeah, exactly.
But I don't really know a ton about him. Just that he's very much a liberal Democrat as opposed to the more conservative Democrat Truman. And I think that's why they got rid of him, is because FDR is not in good health. We might actually have the vice president become president. Oh no.
Excuse me, we're not sure if we want Henry Wallace to be the vice president.
This guy, yeah.
Now these were great stories, and I like this a lot. And I think this is one of his strongest collections in my mind.
Yeah. There was a lot of good stuff in here. A lot of fun. A lot of good fake footnotes. Good maps.
Yeah, the maps are really good. And the maps make it, because frankly, in a book like this, you got to have maps.
You got to have maps. You got to look at the maps and understand the maps to really get the stories. Otherwise, you're just hearing all these towns. I've never heard of this place before.
And then he drove from Barak to Freitur to Wehrmann. It's
well, okay, let me have my perfect recall here.
Yeah, or I got to pull up Google Maps as I listen to this. No, that's a very important. I think that really fleshes it out. I don't know who makes these. I wonder who makes these maps.
I would love to learn how to make my own maps.
Oh yeah, totally. I would totally do that.
Because then we could make our own Tsouras short stories.
That's right.
Do crazy stuff like this.
Henry Wallace saves America.
Yeah.
Just kidding.
No.
No, we could have some fun. We've had some ideas about story. We have had some story ideas.
Oh yes, we certainly have. Yeah.
So it's a long-term project.
Yeah.
Life is busy.
It's been we've written a couple of little snippets of stuff.
We have,
but
I think it's actually pretty funny.
Yeah,
pretty good.
I think so too. There's a lot of potential there, but
it's going to be a while, guys.
It's going to be a long while. Yeah. Woof.
If only we didn't have to work.
That would be great, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
Well, we would still work, but we'd work on this instead of our real jobs.
That's right. Well, yeah, of course. I mean, how else we're gonna, We'll write to Tsouras and we'll be like, we're going to write this next story. We'll just alternate. We'll write 10 stories. I'll write 5 and you write 5. And we're going to write all of them for Peter. And we're going to... Tsouras. Or Tsouras.
According to that guy, which I don't think he's... I think he's wrong.
Peter Tsouras.
Peter Tsouras.
The
Peter Tsouras. Blunting the Bulge.
We'll write a story where... the Germans are so successful at the Bulge, they get right back to Normandy. Well, I guess Christopher Anderson already wrote that story.
Yeah, pretty much, yeah. We could write a story where George S. Patton is actually a woman. He's secretly a woman, and he has like a forbidden love affair with Montgomery. You could do that. Did I send you the article about how Casimir Pulowski was apparently maybe really secretly a woman or whatever?
Yes, that was really interesting. I don't...
So bizarre. Very strange.
I guess...
This person with male pattern baldness and a mustache is about the last person in the world I thought would be really a woman.
True, yeah. But overall, I like this story. I don't know if there's too many Battle of the Bulge alternate scenarios we can really talk about because they really cover them pretty well in this. I mean, I think the Bulge is really like, I think if you want to see bigger changes, the Germans repulsing Normandy would be a better place to look because I think by this point, that's why I think I took such issue with the whole Germans winning in that one story, is that I think it's just too late in the war for the Germans to do anything more than what you see in the Herbstnabel story where they delay their loss by a couple of months. They buy themselves a few months. Right. I just don't see where a Bulge is just, so what? They get to the Meuse River. They still got to get over it. So they get to the Meuse River. Okay, then they got to get to what? Brussels. Then they have to get to Antwerp. They just don't have enough fuel or supplies to do that. So, I mean, I think any alternate history stuff with it is like the sort of Herbstnabel stuff where it's like this tactical move is different than that. And that's a little too in-depth for us, I think.
Because, while all these things are happening, behind the lines, things are getting fortified. Mm-hmm. Supply lines are being intensified. There's people in Britain training at this point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and here's the thing. There were a lot of divisions that were in the order of battle by the end of the war that had either not gotten to France yet, or if they had, they were barely online, and they were fresh new divisions. Mm-hmm. I mean... And here's the thing, if it's really such a disaster, the Italian campaign would be put on hold and troops would be shipped up. They would move stuff from the Pacific or they would move troops from the United States. I mean, they wouldn't just sit there and do nothing. I mean, the Germans were going to be defeated. And at that point, the Allies are not reaching a negotiated disposition. Yeah. And even if the Germans hold out long enough, they're still going to get bombed it's either going to be August of 45 and they're collapsing to the point where no atom bomb is needed, or if they're still in a position of strength, Berlin's getting vaporized. I mean, it's just the Allies at that point are not going to give up. They're not going to say just because the Soviets betrayed us and stopped. That's it.
Right. An excellent short story compilation.
I liked it a lot.
Yeah, me too.
Awesome. I think that's about it. So this is Matt signing off.
And this is Max signing off.
Have a good day, guys.